If you want to write stories your readers will love, there are 3 things you need to do. Understand storytelling principles, see how other writers have applied those principles, and then use them in your own work. Here on the Story Nerd podcast, our goal is to demystify story theory. We'll help you with the first 2 steps so that you can get started with the third. My name is Valerie Francis. I'm a writer and literary editor, and I focus on stories by, for, and about women.
And I'm Melanie Hill, writer, editor, and poet, and I have a passion for spy stories, fairy tales, and master detective novels.
On today's episode, Melanie pitched Lost in Translation so that we can study sequences. This 2003 film was written and directed by Sofia Coppola. At the 76th Academy Awards, Lost in Translation won Coppola Best Original Screenplay. It boggles my mind, but oh well. And the film was also nominated for Best Picture, Best Director for Coppola, Best Actor for Murray, another mind-boggler. It also won 3 Golden Globe Awards and 3 British Academy Film Awards. Of course, there will be spoilers because we can't talk about the movie without talking about the movie. And we would love it if you could give the show a rating and review. For Apple Podcast listeners, you can do it right from your phone. Go to the show's landing page, scroll to the bottom, and you're off to the races. Alrighty, Melanie. I'm really curious. Why did you choose this movie?
Because I've never seen it and I wanted to see it.
Now that you've seen it, how do you feel?
Well, that's a very good question. I feel very confused actually by the movie. And I think, but I know why, which is a good thing. I do know why. And when I go into genre, I think that'll be clue number 1. So if I look at the external genres, I don't think there is one in this film. So there is not much from a visual perspective that really happens. And I think that's problematic. And then there is an internal genre, and I think that's the global. I'm not 100% convinced it works, but I've got that down as a worldview education because it shifts, I think, Charlotte's arc more from meaningless to meaningful, and Bob, well, I don't know, and that's problematic. But I do point out why I think that's problematic later on in the story. And I'm going to offer this up as in the spirit of sometimes we learn more from things that don't work than things that do work. What did you have for genre?
Well, I agree that the global genre for Lost in Translation is internal. And by internal, I mean that the story is primarily about what's going on in the internal world of the characters, specifically with Bob, because I do think he's the primary protagonist. So, in other words, this is a character-driven story. Now, I also pegged it as worldview education. However, I do have to read into the story, and I'll talk about why that is in a few minutes. But first, a worldview education story is one in which the character discovers the meaning in their lives, and you just mentioned that, meaninglessness to meaning. They discover what's really important to them. So this whole COVID experience we've all been through was a massive worldview education story for us on a particular level, because so many people discovered that, for example, that being with their family was so much more important than the rat race that they had been living. That's just one example. So perhaps Bob discovers that it's his family that's most important to him, and that's why he doesn't stay in Japan with Charlotte. Or maybe it's that he discovers that his career is more important than the endorsement money. Now, the audience is never told explicitly because in the end, Bob is whispering in Charlotte's ear and the audience isn't privy to what he says. But at the end of the movie, Bob does seem to be much happier and much more content than he was at the beginning of the film. He seems to have gotten a little bit of the spring back in his step. So I agree with you. The global genre is internal. And it is possible to have an internal genre story without an external genre. That is a story that takes place entirely within the mind of the character with nothing whatsoever or not much happening in the physical world. I haven't come across an example, but I remember Sean Coyne suggesting that James Joyce would fall into this category. And I admit I have not gone back to reread Joyce to study it and drill down on it. The stories that I enjoy and the ones I write all have external genres as well as internal genres. So going back and studying Joyce is not very high on my list of things to do. All right. Okay. It's not on my list of things to do at all, to tell you the truth. So, in saying that, what's the external genre of Lost in Translation? I really had to think about this one. I really did. It's marketed as a romantic comedy drama, which tells me that the studio didn't have a clue what to make of it either.
Is that really what it's marketed as?
That is really what it's marketed as. Yes.
Oh dear.
But okay, so I had to analyze the movie. I spent a lot of time on genre this week. I'm calling it a love story. At first, I thought it was sort of a loosey-goosey suggestion of a love story. It is certainly light years away from Pride and Prejudice, which is sort of, the one that started it all, the one that started the romance genre, for instance. But upon closer inspection, I think that the main elements of a love story are actually there. Now, the tricky thing about Lost in Translation is that it is not an arc plot story, which is the classic story form, what we think of when we talk about story. Pride and Prejudice is arc plot. Every rom-com you've ever seen is arc plot. Romance novels are arc plot. So it's not going to be an apples to apples comparison because the form of the story is different. Lost in Translation is a multi-protagonist, multi-plot story, and it's much shorter than the standard 2-hour feature film. It's only an hour and 40 minutes. So because it has 2 protagonists and 2 storylines, and because it's shorter, there isn't enough time to fully realize the love story like we would expect to see in a rom-com, for instance. So I think the love story is suggested rather than told explicitly. And these are elements of a love story that I found pretty easy. We've got a lovers meet scene. In fact, we have 2 of them. The first one is the elevator when Charlotte turns to Bob and she smiles. The second one comes right at the end of the first act, and this is when they're in the bar. The reason I'm saying there are 2 is because Charlotte doesn't remember the first one. Bob remembers the first, Charlotte remembers the second. They do have what's typically called a first kiss, but I think it's important for us to sort of expand that idea of a kiss out. Like a kiss is an intimate moment. So there's plenty of examples where the lovers don't have a kiss until the very end. Pride and Prejudice is one of them, but they do have a first intimate moment. And Charlotte and Bob do have that at the end of Act 2, and that's when they fall asleep on the bed together and Bob touches Charlotte's bare foot. There's a lovers breakup scene. Charlotte catches Bob in his hotel room with the jazz singer, and they have a bit of a spat at the sushi restaurant. They do have a moment where the lovers reconnect. Although they're not physical lovers, they are the couple in the romance. This first happens, I think this is like a 2-parter. The first step of this lovers reconnecting is outside the hotel after the fire alarm goes off. This is right after their fight, and they kind of make up. And then ultimately at the end of the movie, when Bob finds Charlotte in the street and whispers in her ear. They do have a ritual. Neither of them can sleep, and so they keep meeting each other at various places in the hotel in the wee hours of the morning or late at night. They do date for all intents and purposes. There are a series of social events that bring them closer and closer together. And there is a real reason that they cannot be together, and that's that they're both married, which is a pretty good reason. The marriages actually form marriage love story subplots, which serve as complications to the Bob and Charlotte love story and the global internal genres or arcs for both protagonists. Okay. So I did a little bit of research for this one, a very little bit of research. And if Wikipedia is to be believed, Sofia Coppola found it too difficult to plot a movie. Now, right away, that got my dander up. So instead of doing the hard work of plotting the movie, She wrote paragraphs that were snippets of her own experiences in Tokyo. And then she used her industry connections to get the film made and have Bill Murray star in it. Now, that is the kind of thing you can do when your father is Francis Ford Coppola. For the rest of us, we got to learn our craft. And if you have those connections, for heaven's sake, use them. I would. If I had them, I would use them. I have no connections. None. Now, personally, I am delighted that there is no sex scene between Bob and Charlotte, because that, for me, would have just been creepy. Bob is like a father figure to her. Yes, of course, it makes him feel good when a beautiful young woman buys him a drink. But when they go out on their first date, he does what a parent does with a kid. He asks, "Where's your shoes? Where's your keys? Where's your bag?" Now, you don't do that on a first date, not if you want a second date anyway. But that's the type of thing that I did with my kids when they were little. Another example is when Charlotte hurts her foot and he insists on taking her to the hospital. That is very much a parental act, and the whole way he's behaving there is very much like a parent, not a lover. So even if we are to excuse all of that and say, well, okay, in the first instance, he's making a joke when he's asking her where her keys and stuff are, and sort of trying to make the whole thing less awkward. Or, in the hospital instance, maybe he's just being kind. Okay, I can go with that. But when this film was made, Scarlett Johansson was only 17. Bill Murray was 53. That's a 36-year age gap, and I am no prude, but that is significant. And quite possibly, hopefully, it would have been illegal, what with her being a minor. So anyway, that's what I have for genre. What do you think about that, Melanie?
Well, I like the idea. So the intimacy part of that, I understand. And this isn't a comment on what you've just said. I'm just talking about the movie. So it's an intimacy thing that I get, and I can see that as it being a romance or some sort of. I don't understand that. That to me does not work, because I think it tries to, but it doesn't work in terms of a romance for some of the reasons that you've stated in terms of age difference and the way Bob behaves towards Charlotte. So to me, if you look at it from a relationship building perspective, I can see that is more of the external genre, because I can see that's going on, but I don't get the romance aspect of that. So that would be the only. And I don't know if you're saying anything different, that you are saying it's more of a romantic kind of love story. I see it as a relationship story. So I've like the umbrella for that is broader for, because I think it's problematic. And I actually don't think that Bob might think about what he could do from a physical sense with Charlotte, but I actually don't ever think that he really engages in that in any way with intent. I know I'm saying very vague about this, but yeah. And I think that just sums up my vagary around that, just really sums up my struggle with actually understanding what was driving the characters for a lot of the story and why they were in the situations that they were in. And I just, to be honest, I just thought Bob was a bit of a man-child. Like, serious, like, oh, he's got a wife and children, which he, at the end of the story, in one of the climactic moments, he says that his children are everything, but yet he wants to run away from them, and he's upset with the fact that when they had children, his life changed, and suddenly he didn't want to engage in that role of being a parent and would rather run away from it. Anyway, I'll get on a rant if I go further, but
he is a difficult character to empathize with for all of those reasons. He is a very wealthy white American male who is having a midlife crisis. Okay. He does complain about his wife and his marriage, that it was great at the beginning, but since the kids came along, she seems to want to spend all her time with the kids. And now I'm trying to be my professional neutral editor self, but I'm still a mom and a woman. And I thought to myself, maybe she had to stay home and look after the children because that's kind of what you do as a parent. And he's never there. So
Mm.
who's going to look after the children? So I think we might, or I anyway, I might have empathized more with his situation because he's sort of lamenting the loss of his career. He should be doing movies. He would rather be on the stage, and these endorsement deals are all he can get. Okay, he's getting paid $2 million for what he's doing. Even in 2003. I mean, that's a lot of money now, but that was even more money in 2003. I think I would have empathized with him more had we seen him as a brilliant actor who was no longer able to get parts, right? If we had seen that struggle.
Well, we saw it in Tootsie.
Yes, exactly. So you could empathize with that character more.
Yeah, absolutely. And because he was in that movie, in that situation, which is interesting now that I think about it. But yes, he was a far more empathetic character in Tootsie because it's Bill Murray playing that best friend of Dustin Hoffman's character. You could empathize with that far more than you could, I think, with Bob in Lost in Translation.
So we have bookended our season with out of work actors. Awesome. Okay, so how did you do with your study of sequences this episode?
Well, that's a very good question. So it was very difficult to break down the sequences because it's hard to see what the rising action is for all of the units of story. So with the other movies this season, I've been able to identify the sequences by the rising action and also identify the single central action because I've understood what the emotional spectrum of the story is moving along, or what the core value is that's at stake. And this was a lot harder in Lost in Translation because so much of what happens is inside of the characters' heads. And what made it even more difficult was the sparsity of the dialogue. So the action or understanding about the movie occurs in the subtext, and it occurs in the setting and the lack of interaction Bob and Charlotte have with their respective partners, and the differences between cultures and how alone that being in a different culture can make you feel. So that's a very hard area in the subtext to be looking for a lot of the story the main points of the story. However, this week I did, with the help of Robert McKee's book Dialogue and a few other internet resources, I settled on the existential crisis going on inside Bob and Charlotte. So on the surface, they are successful enough, but on the inside, they have nothing to share with the people in their lives. So they are both lost in life. And I think that links back to the title, Lost in Translation. I think they are lost, full stop. And then the added layer of being in a different country gives you an element of things that are lost in translation through, interpretation and trying to understand other things that are not familiar to you. So with that in mind, the story question that I came up with to help me identify each sequence was, will Bob and Charlotte find meaning for themselves? Now, I could identify the 3 acts in this movie, but I really struggled with the 8 sequences this week, especially in the second half of the movie. So I started this week by looking at the larger story unit of the act, and I broke the story into 3 acts just because I could pick those out, not easily, but I could find them. So for Act 1, it focuses on Bob and Bob's reason for being in Japan. He's mostly by himself with his escorts or working on the ad campaign in that first act. The second act starts when Charlotte sends Bob a drink at the bar, and the midpoint is when Bob tells Charlotte he's organising a prison break and she says she's in. The second half of Act 2 starts then with the night out with Charlotte's friends, and I think it ends after the trip to the hospital when they hold hands going back to the hotel. Now, I propose that the third act starts around the strip club scene. So this act then becomes the meaty part of the movie because we see the intimate discussion Bob and Charlotte have about what Charlotte is meant to be and also about marriage and children. So there's no physical contact. And yes, there is when, he does grab her foot, but what I mean in terms of a romantic physical contact, I suppose. And then Bob has a one-night stand with the red-headed singer from the bar. So the contrast between intimacy and sex, I think, is really there for people to see. And there is a difference, and it's laid out quite obviously on the screen. And this is really the moment in the movie that we've been waiting for, and I'm being very broad with that, to see if Bob and Charlotte develop a physical relationship. But it turns out they don't. And I thank goodness for exactly the same reasons you said before, Valerie. Because I think the movie is about not being lost, or about being lost and finding your way towards something. So I think that for them to have a physical relationship, I think that would actually have been a cop-out, a sell-out. So the ending, though, is when Bob leaves, but it's also about the way Bob and Charlotte part. They've had a shared experience and found something. Well, I think Charlotte finds something, and it could be a way back to John, her husband. And then I'm not sure about Bob. I think by deciding to go back home and to stop avoiding his wife, it could be interpreted as some sort of direction, if that's what's really happening. But again, this highlights problems about, well, what is really going on, and understanding what a character's motivation is. And I think we need to understand the motivation to be able to empathise with our characters in a story. And this is one of the problems that I found this week with this particular story. Now, I have focused on Bob as the protagonist this week because we enter and exit the movie with him. But I believe it's Charlotte who has the largest change in the movie. And we see this two other times, and we've seen this two other times in movies this season. So we've seen it, Marianne's change in Sense and Sensibility, and that it's greater than Eleanor's, but it's Eleanor's story that starts and ends the movie. However, in this case, I think Valerie and I agreed that Marianne was the protagonist in the story, despite the beginning and the end. All right, and we then had Sliding Doors also featured competing protagonists in the brunette Helen storyline. So Jerry was the primary character in that storyline when we look at what was happening on the screen, and he was probably more interesting in that storyline as well. So the question I think we need to ask is, does this matter? And I believe the answer is yes. And why? Because stories are about change. And if the largest change occurs to a character who isn't the protagonist, then the audience stops focusing on the main character and focuses on the secondary character. The protagonist's change isn't as compelling or significant as one of the other characters, and then the story is possibly being told about the wrong character. Now, we did look at this in Good Will Hunting because there were times when Will was not the centre of conflict in a scene or a sequence. And this is what I said in that episode. So the change in the protagonist for the scenes and the sequence doesn't change the overall protagonist for the story. This works as long as the conflict is centred around the story's theme, and the greatest value shift or change in the story is in the protagonist. And so I see this as problematic for Lost in Translation. Right, so this week I still did attempt to identify the single central action for each sequence in Lost in Translation. And I'll tell you now, I have more confidence in the first 4 sequences than I do in the second 4. But anyway, this is what I've had. So in sequence 1, I had down that and this focuses around Bob, and that he was taking direction in a different language. And I thought that really was the driving factor in sequence 1, especially when he goes to the movie set. In sequence 2, I had the single central action as being James Bond, because that was what they were trying to get Bob to be like when he was filming the ads. And that I actually thought that interchange was quite funny. In sequence 3, I had Charlotte and Bob meet at the bar. Now, it's sequence 3 that usually reinforces the larger movie question, and this occurs in Lost in Translation. We see Bob and Charlotte among people, but with nothing much to say until their insomnia brings them together at the bar. And the question, will Bob and Charlotte find meaning for themselves, is restated in this sequence because they meet and then they have to find things to say to each other. Now, sequence 4, I've got Bob offers a prison break. Sequence 5 is a night out with friends. Sequence 6 is get Charlotte to the hospital. Now, sequence 7 is the platonic sleepover. And I've got here a question that I think sort of resonates with this sequence is, what is going on between Bob and Charlotte? And then for sequence 8, I've got a goodbye with meaning. So there were some genuinely funny moments, and my favourite was when the masseuse arrived in Bob's room. That to me was quite a funny scene. It's like, anyway, and I thought the funniest parts of the movie are the literal moments when the messages are lost in translation or cultural differences are way too far to bridge. And it's in these moments that I think provide also the majority of the physical action in this story. Now, the part of the movie where Bob and Charlotte are lost, where they're lost, is harder to identify or are harder to identify. The action in this case occurs in the characters' heads, as we've both mentioned. And this is more difficult to see because it's meant to be in the dialogue, and there isn't much dialogue, and it focuses more about what's not said. And there's an awful lot of no dialogue and reading between the lines to the point where it is hard to tell what's going on. So, do the sequences pose and build up the answer to the dramatic question in the movie? Well, I can't help but feel that Charlotte's question is answered. And like I've mentioned before, I'm not sure if Bob's is or isn't. And I believe it's the age difference between the two that impacts on how I see the end of the movie for each character. So Charlotte is on the cusp of a new life, having married young, and she's finished university. So she cannot find a connection with much in her world, but she has found a connection with Bob and started to be interested in what she sees. And she also starts to become a bit more interesting as well. So I have a sense of optimism for her by the end of the movie. Bob, on the other hand, well, as mentioned, I don't have much empathy for him. And I completely understand his wife's comment when she says if he wants Japanese food, then he could stay in Japan. I think that's very telling about the state of their relationship. So he checked himself out of his own life by not stepping up to the plate when his children were born. And he does mention the moment when they're born, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But Bob is warning Charlotte to find something to direct her life and give her a purpose by the end of the movie. And I think they're kind of words of wisdom, but he also says he's not worried about her, which links back to us both, I think, having a bit of an education theme to this story. But to kind of go on a bit more about my problems with Bob, and there's evidence in the script in the movie. So, and I think this is really fascinating. I think there is a level of cognitive dissonance that flows through Bob for most of the movie. On one hand, he says things like, "The more you know who you are and what you want, the less you let things upset you." Then he goes on to say this about his marriage. "We used to have a lot of fun. Lydia would come when I'd make movies and we would laugh. Now she doesn't want to leave the kids and she doesn't need me to be there. The kids miss me, but they're fine. It gets a whole lot more complicated when you have kids." So this is a man who's missed his son's birthday and doesn't respond to his wife when she tries to communicate with him about the kids or carpet swatches. Then he says this about his kids: "It's the most terrifying day of your life when the first one is born. Your life as you know it is never going to return. But they learn how to walk and how to talk, and you want to be with them. And they turn out to be the most delightful people you'll ever meet in your life." So he says so many contradictory things when he in this scene, and this is within a couple of minutes or seconds of each other. And so for a man who apparently knows more about himself and then goes on to be so confused in his thoughts, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And I think and that's why I thought there's a level of cognitive dissonance with him about what he does and what he thinks and what he says. And again, this is a level of contradiction in Bob's actions and his thoughts. And even at this point of the movie, he's still lost. But it's after he spends the night with the singer where suddenly he's not as lost. And this is when I think about his comment about knowing who you are and what you want. And I did wonder a lot about whether his actions and his thoughts gel at all through the movie. Now, I know I haven't given you much regarding sequences this week, and I think it's because of it's such an internal character-driven story, and it is difficult to tell what's going on at times. However, after watching films like Lost in Translation, I do wonder if this story would be better told in a book. The audience might have access to the internal thoughts of the characters in a book, and there would be scope to provide the reader with a greater level of sharing the experience of being lost in their characters. So, Valerie, that's pretty much my take on Lost in Translation. Is there anything you want to add to that or talk about or go to beginnings and endings?
I also thought this would be a really interesting novel. And, you know, we're both novelists, yet we're talking about films every week because, on a high level, every story, no matter the medium through which it's told, has the same form, the same principles apply. But each form of storytelling, whether it's a novel or a screenplay or a TV show, long form TV show, or a stage play, they all have strengths and weaknesses. With a novel's big advantage that it can do that no other form of storytelling can do is that it can get into the head of the character. And this is a story that takes place almost entirely within the heads and hearts of Bob and Charlotte. So when you have, going back to what we said off the top of the show, you can have a story that is internal only. And if that's a novel, you have something like, a character sitting in a room thinking. And that's kind of it. But in a film version in particular, I think this is true of novels as well, but particularly in a film, which is a visual medium, you need something physically happening in the world to give the audience something to look at. So that physical thing that's happening in the real world that we're looking at, that's the external genre. So it's an action story or a love story or a war story or a whatever, those types of stories, right? And when you have a film that is primarily about what's going on inside the character, you have to rely on things like voiceover. You see a lot of that, or casting really, really amazing actors and having a really super script. This is going to sound so jaded. It's not meant to be. It's almost like this movie was so different that it confused people so much they thought, wow, it must be really something. I better vote for it. Give it an Academy Award.
I absolutely agree with you. And I do think, one of the things that we have to choose when we're writing a story is the medium that we want to tell that story in. And to me, this is, and if what you said at the beginning of the episode is true, that this was based on a series of paragraphs, then I don't understand the choice to turn it into a movie and not a novel, because it sort of sounded like that was where it started in the first place. And it would have made more sense to me. And I think it would have been a far better experience, because it visually, like you said, this, I don't think the medium of the internal genre fits in a movie. I think when we saw The Water Horse, we could see the internal story, but there was a lot of surface, there was a lot of action going on as well, and they complemented each other. Whereas this just doesn't happen in this movie at all, and it even fails on really putting even micro actions out there that allow you to understand the headspace of the characters, because you can do that with some action, but we have major skips, particularly in Bob's storyline of, like you said, he ends up happy, but we're not really sure why he's happy and what decision he's made or why he's made to go home. And I don't think it would have taken much to maybe give us a clue or a hint as to why that happened. So there were things that you can do with micro actions or smaller scenes that would give you access into their thinking without, doing a voiceover. Mm.
Yeah, I mean, intellectually, I understand what's going on in this movie, um, because I have the skills to analyze it and look at it and all that good stuff. But I didn't emotionally connect to it. So I'm not saying I don't like the movie. I can appreciate it from a craft point of view and understand what's happening from a craft point of view. But I couldn't connect with it. I believe Scarlett Johansson won a BAFTA for this. She's only 17, and wow, she's good. She's very good. Um, and I understand intellectually that Bob is lost. The movie industry doesn't want him anymore. His wife doesn't need him anymore. His children, sure, they miss him, but they're getting along fine. So he used to be all that in a bag of chips. And now suddenly no one needs him anymore. No one really wants him anymore. And he doesn't quite know what to do with that. But he's still really rich. He's very, very wealthy. And he is still getting endorsement deals. He's healthy. He just has sort of a malaise. I am going to study empathy, not next season, but soon, because this is a really important topic. And empathy and sympathy are not the same things. And neither of them is pity. So at most, I have some pity for Bob because he is lost. Sympathy means he's likable. I don't particularly like him as a character. Empathy means that there is something about him that I can connect with emotionally. And there isn't. So let me use Harry Potter as an example. I have never, ever been an 11-year-old boy. I have never been forced to sleep under the stairs. I am not a wizard or a witch. I cannot connect with any of the things in Harry's physical world. Yet, I empathize with him incredibly because I have been the odd one out. I know exactly what it feels like to not belong, or to feel like I don't belong, or to not know what's going on when everybody else seems to know what's going on. Right? I know what it's like to deal with a bully. Those are the shared human experiences that create empathy with a character. I don't have any of that with Bob. I've been where Charlotte has been in terms of, and everyone has, right? When they're young and they're either going into post-secondary or they just come out of post-secondary, and then they say, well, now what do I do with my life? I have to pick a field and go for it. That I could empathize with.
Yes.
And that was all I could empathize with in terms of what she was going through. So empathy and sympathy are not the same thing. Neither of them are pity. And at most, I have pity for Bob. Although from a craft point of view, on an intellectual level, I can understand what's happening in this movie.
Yeah, and can I just add something like the points you made about Bob there? Like, if I think back to Colonel Jessup from A Few Good Men, you don't like him, but he's got a logic or a rationale that you can go, that makes a level of sense, and you can have some form of empathy with the logic.